Hello, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Indxx Insights Podcast. This is a podcast where we bring together industry experts to share their insights on market trends with all of you. I'm your host, Rahul Sen Sharma, and today we have a special guest, my colleague and friend, Vaibhav Agarwal, the Chief Product Officer here at Indxx, with whom we'll delve into the fascinating world of market dominance and corporate leadership. Vaibhav, welcome to the show and thanks for coming.
Thanks, Rahul. Glad to be here.
So let's not waste any time and let's dive right in. We keep hearing about how supposedly a few big companies are taking over everything. Is this real or is it just kind of media and PR hype?
It's quite real, actually, Rahul. Talking about the U.S. market itself, if you look at the S&P 500, the top 10 companies there are not just leading; they're actually absolutely dominating. Look at the information technology sector within the S&P 500. There are about 65 constituents there. Of those, if you look at the top 10, they constitute about 78% of the market share. Wow. Microsoft alone contributes about 22%. And it's not just information technology. If you look at Amazon, for example, in its respective sector, it holds about 38% of the market cap. So it's real, and it's across sectors.
That's incredible. And I think if you're not in the indexing or the ETF world, maybe you're not so familiar with it. But we, of course, know about special rebalances that have happened because of extreme concentration in certain sectors and industries. And even in well-known indexes like the NASDAQ 100, you've had to do these types of rebalances because there is such a dominating factor among just a handful of companies. So that's really astounding. So Vaibhav, what really fascinates me in that example and just in general is how these dominant leader type companies are strategically reshaping market dynamics on a global scale through oftentimes innovative partnerships and infrastructure development. I think a great example of that a lot of people are familiar with at this point is Microsoft and their early and massive, consistently massive investment in OpenAI. But you also have Amazon's cloud infrastructure investments over the last decade or more. You have Google's recent and also very, very large AI infrastructure investments and developments. At the end of the day, these aren't just competitive advantages, right? They're fundamentally redefining how technology, how business, and global infrastructure all interact. Could you help our listeners understand these key attributes a bit more and how those dominant leader type attributes have helped these companies become what we call market leaders?
Sure. And those are three great examples, Rahul, each in its own right having the dominance because of different factors. Now, it all boils down to several key characteristics which we call competitive moats. I'm sure people in the investing world and outside of it have heard of moats and how it relates to investing. Now, what are moats and how do these companies really become dominant in their spaces? The moats can include, established market share, leading positions in certain segments of the space. They could be first mover advantages. They could be, huge brand recognition. There can be economies of scale, proprietary technologies, and network effects. Take Google, for instance. Mm-hmm. In the search engine industry, it holds about 80% of the market share. And that's not just in the US. Globally, it has that high market share, or even higher in some countries. Look at Microsoft. It came out with Windows in 1985. And today it has created an ecosystem around Windows, so much so that Windows today has about 70% market share in the OS segment. So these companies have built their dominance on account of these moats that they hold. So we're seeing is these dominance factors enabling these companies across sectors to hold those dominant positions.
And it's really long term. You talked about Google's 80% market share. I think as of 2023, but Google has had a dominant market share for 20 years now. Before that, you had Ask Jeeves and a few other kind of search engines, but it's basically Google these days. And I remember, looking at the data from South Korea, where there was that 90% market share by Google, and if you wanted to advertise anywhere, it was Google or nothing because nothing else made sense.
You're right, Rahul. Especially with Google, I mean, it's become so prevalent that Googling actually has become a verb. It's basically become a universal verb for searching for anything on the internet. Similarly, with Microsoft, I mean, Windows, even small children today recognize what Windows is, even if they do not know that it's from Microsoft. So that's the kind of dominance these companies have today in the technology space and in other spaces as well.
Enduring, long-term, very difficult to displace.
Very difficult to displace.
And in a lot of cases, economically the best option for consumers.
Of course, yeah. I mean, see, with dominance, they have pricing power. They can cut costs and they can cut prices then to lure the customers. There's a saying that one of my professors used to say: if you have a customer, don't let them go. Just hold on to that customer, however you can. Because if you lose a customer, getting them back is very difficult. So yeah, I mean their market leading positions for over multiple decades is very enduring, as you've seen in multiple sectors.
Fascinating. So, speaking about dominance and speaking about global dynamics, let's talk about the pharmaceutical industry a bit because that's been in the news for positive and negative reasons lately. But let's look at the pharmaceutical industry and maybe we could talk a little bit about what happened with the pharmaceutical industry and drug development in general, starting with the COVID-19 pandemic. To the best of my knowledge, companies like Pfizer and Moderna didn't just develop the COVID-19 vaccine and other vaccines. They rewrote the playbook for rapid innovation, public-private partnership, and global health infrastructure. The pandemic just exposed how, to a lot of us, these companies can literally, with their massive R&D spending and pocketbooks and capabilities, just reshape global healthcare outcomes for the entire planet.
You're right, Rahul, and pharma industry is a very good example. So far, we have spoken about the Microsofts of the world. So technology people can still understand, relate to, but if you look at the pharma industry, the barriers to entry that they have is huge. If you look at it, the pharma industry itself is expected to grow from about $1.5 trillion to about $2.5 trillion by 2029. Now, you'd expect a lot more companies to be in there, but here's the catch. Drug development is not easy and it's not cheap. Out of 5,000 drugs that enter the preclinical phase, only about 5 make it to clinical trials, and only 1 gets approved. So it's 1 in 5,000. And you think it's cheap? No. I mean, the development costs have gone from about $800 million adjusted for inflation to about $1.5 billion today per drug. So, these leading companies do have that advantages because, as you rightly said, they have deep pockets and they can invest to get to where they want to be. And that's why they maintain those dominant leadership positions in that in the pharma industry.
So these are all great data points. It's just very surprising to me how you've got 5,000 potential drugs in development and only 1 of them makes it over the finish line to approval for human use. Let's dig in a little bit deeper. I mean, if we look at just 2 companies, Merck and Pfizer, how do these massive companies like them, how do even companies like them manage to succeed in such a challenging environment?
It's all about research and development, Rahul. Look at Merck and Company. They spent $30.5 billion on R&D in 2023. That represents 51% of their revenues. So these companies invest heavily in innovation, building reputation and trust. They're not just selling drugs. They're developing solutions to complex medical challenges, which require a significant amount of investment that only these companies can afford.
So when you talk about these types of numbers, it's almost like we're seeing the emergence of corporate nation states. Another great example, which I'll pick on since it's one of the largest, if not at this point, the largest company in the world by market cap, is Apple. Their cash reserves alone are larger than the GDP of many countries in the world. And they've used that money in a myriad of different ways to be dominant or to try and be dominant. You look at their acquisition recently of AI companies and investments in AI. You look at their push or their attempted push for a long time into electric vehicles and the massive amounts of money they spent there. You look at the ecosystem very successfully that they've built around personal computing, starting with the iPhone. At this point, these aren't just product strategies. These are basically geopolitical maneuvers of companies that are almost like their own countries. Do you have any final insights for our listeners about these companies that are dominant leaders?
You make a good point, Rahul. And Apple is a prime example of how ecosystems are built. And you're right in saying that these are not just technology companies or dominant companies now. They lend a lot of credibility to political and geopolitical maneuvers around the world. You've seen, how Twitter, for example, people claim it influences elections, or how Google and Meta have that power, those network effects to sort of, influence geopolitical maneuvers around the world. And Apple, you talked about iPhone. I remember standing in 2007, standing in the queue outside the Apple store in New York to get my first iPhone.
Oh,
I
you were there
wasn't
too?
able to. Yeah, I wasn't able to. I couldn't get it. But I was there. I was interning at the time. But yeah, the key takeaway here is that these companies don't just lead by accident. They consistently invest in their infrastructure, in their dominant brand positioning. They leverage their scale. They create ecosystems that are very difficult to disrupt. We've seen this occur consistently across the years. We built an index on it. It's called the Dominant Leaders Index. And when we built that, we expected this to happen. But the result actually did validate our expectations, in that of the top 10 constituents across the entire history of this index, 70% have been the same companies. What that proves is, that these companies, once they get into those dominant positions, for various amount of factors that we spoke about, they tend to maintain those dominant positions, and people tend to use their products and services to such an extent that they're able to maintain those positions in the long run. So these dominant positions are very enduring.
And the way you measure dominant positions, at least in that index, is using market share, correct? And that market share was dominance over time.
Yeah, and one of the characteristics we spoke about was market share, and that's, you rightly mentioned, that's what we use to build that index. Mm-hmm. And you have your Apples in there, you have your Amazons in there, you have your Tesla in there. Mm-hmm. So all these companies are the names that you think of when you talk about their respective sectors. And yes, there are other ways of creating that or establishing that dominance. But in this product, for example, we use the market share, and we found that leading market share was also an enduring factor.
Mm-hmm. And one more thing I do remember about that index is that there are companies in there that are not your typical tech-heavy companies or your pharmaceutical companies. You also have companies in there like Home Depot, which people don't initially think about as being dominant. But if you drive around America, Home Depot is pretty dominant in terms of that specific area in which they operate.
Right. So as I said, technology companies or the Amazons of the world are easy to understand. Mm-hmm. You would expect them to be there, but what was surprising to us in some ways was there are many companies in the US that are dominant in their respective fields. Mm-hmm. Home Depot is a good example. Walmart, okay, you can expect, but Home Depot you probably would not expect to be in that position. And there are many more such companies out there for our viewers to look at. Mm-hmm. But yeah, these companies have established those dominance over years, and we believe that it's going to last, and that's why that index has done so well over the course of its history.
These have been really useful insights, Vaibhav. You've given me and all of our listeners out there, I think, a masterclass in understanding how today's dominant companies and dominant leaders really work and operate, and why what they do is so enduring over time. So thanks so much for coming on our inaugural Indxx Insights podcast. It's been a real pleasure having you on. I look forward to doing many more of these with you in the future.
Thanks, Rahul. The pleasure's been all mine.
And that's all we have for today. Thanks for joining us, and tune in next time to the Indxx Insights podcast.